Hi everyone, this is Brittany and today I'm going to show you how to make a mask. Some of these video clips are sped up, by the way. So we're going to start by cutting the fabric. You're going to want to cut it about 8 inches wide and 10 inches long. And you will need 2 pieces of fabric. They can be the same fabric or 2 different patterns like I'm using. And then you just cut it so they are the same size. I had one already cut, so I put it on top to cut the second piece, but you could also just line up the fabric beforehand and then cut them at the same time. Okay, now that the main piece of fabric is cut, we are going to work on cutting 4 straps for the mask. And I kind of eyeballed it, but you're going to want them to be about 1.5 inches wide and about 18 inches long. So I folded my fabric in half because it was about 36 inches long, so then I wouldn't have to cut as many pieces. So again, you're just going to want each piece to be about 1.5 inches wide and 18 inches long. So if you're like me and you cut the fabric folded in half, just snip it at the fold so that way you have 4 pieces that are 18 inches long and 1.5 inches wide. Now we are going to begin sewing the main part of the mask. Before you start, you want to make sure that the parts of the mask that you want showing when you're done are facing in towards each other, so the ugly parts of the fabric are facing out. To begin stitching, you're going to start about 1.5 to 2 inches away from the top corner of your mask because we want to leave a little bit of a hole, but we want it to be close to a corner, so that way when we flip the mask inside out and when we insert the nose piece, that the hole will be close to the edge and it'll make it easier to do. So go ahead and stitch all along the side with really thin margins. And then when you get to the corner, all you have to do is make sure the needle is still in the fabric. Then just lift up the foot of the sewing machine and you can rotate your fabric so that way it is ready for the following side. And then again, you just want to have as thin of margins as possible and then do the same thing on all sides. Just leave the needle in at the corners so that way you can rotate the fabric easily. And continue to do that until you get to the final corner, and then I'll give you further instructions. Okay, now that you're close to the last corner, you're going to do the same thing as before, so just leave the needle in and then rotate the fabric. And then you're going to want to find where you started your stitch and not get too close to that because you want to leave about 1 inch wide to 1.5 inches wide hole so that way you can flip your fabric inside out. Make sure to do a reverse stitch so that way your stitching does not come undone. And then you're just going to lift your needle out and then cut off the string so that way you can continue from there. Now before you flip it inside out, you're going to want to cut off any excess edges or string so that way when you fold it inside out, there's not a bunch of bulk inside the fabric. So just take a little bit of time and cut pretty close to the stitches that you made and make sure to trim off any strings that still remain. Once you've trimmed the edges, you will also want to trim the corners off at a diagonal so that way again when you flip it inside out there won't be a bunch of bulk inside the fabric, and then you can just start to carefully flip the mask inside out through the hole that you made. Make sure you're careful so that way you don't accidentally rip your stitches out. And then once you have it inside out, just put your finger inside so that way you can poke out the corners so that way they are more of a right angle instead of just a glob of fabric. And then once you've got all 4 corners, you should be able to pull it straight and you should have a rectangle. Now we are going to take a minute to work on the straps because it'll save us work in the future if we do them now. So what you're going to do is kind of like a tri-fold where you fold the fabric in on itself long ways. So you're going to fold it about a third over and then a third over again, and then pin the fold that you made, and you're going to do that all the way down the length of all 4 straps. And I will show another angle of how to do this in just a second. It takes a little bit of practice, and if you need to make the straps thicker so that way it's easier to do this process, then that's totally fine. I just didn't want to waste fabric. So here's how to do the straps. Once you've pinned them all, I will show you how to sew them. And as I said, here's another angle of me doing the same process on a different strap. So you fold the fabric a third over, and then fold the remaining third over top of that, and then pin through the fabric. Alright, so again, when you have done that, you should have done all 4 straps, if I can count. And then what you're going to do is you're going to do a slight stitch across the edge of your straps, that way it doesn't come unraveled. You'll have to be careful with this, and a thicker fabric might be good because sometimes the thinner fabrics get caught up in the needle. So you're going to do a front stitch, then a back stitch, and then again leave your needle down, and then just rotate the fabric so that way you can stitch along the length of the strap as close as you can to the edge of the fabric, and you might have to use a scissor tip or something to get the fabric started through the foot like I did. And then just carefully stitch again as close as you can along the raw edge of the fabric all the way down the strap. Also, when you are pinning the straps initially, don't worry about the lines being too perfect because you can always kind of tweak it as you stitch, like I'm doing here. As you take out each pin, you can kind of straighten the line so that way if any bunching happens, you can kind of mess with it as you go so that way it's straight. When you get to the end, you're kind of going to do the reverse of what we did before. So you're going to get close to the end, and then you're going to leave the needle down and then rotate your fabric. So that way you can do that line across the edge again like we did before. So do a straight stitch forward and then do a back stitch and then stitch forward a little bit, and then you can trim the ends. And it should look something like this, and you can of course trim off those pieces of string. If you are like me and you get too close to the edge and miss your fabric, you can always sew back over top of that section so that way there's no holes. Now I'm going to show you how to attach the straps to the mask and add a nose piece if desired. So if you remember that hole that we had before, where we flip the mask inside out, you're going to start at the opposite corner at the top of your mask, and you're going to start at the very corner. Again, do a front stitch, then a reverse stitch, and then go all the way down until you're right at about the opening that we left before. See, I'm getting pretty close to the hole, so I'm going to stop right there. And what we're going to use for the nose piece is I'm actually going to use a straightened bobby pin, but you can use something else. So I'm going to make sure my needle is still in my fabric, and then I can lift up the foot and push the bobby pin through the seam that I created. So you're going to want to make sure to leave a little bit of room from your previous stitch so that way you can fit that bobby pin in there. Once you have the bobby pin in, then you can continue stitching until you get to the corner. Make sure your edges are tucked in so that way they don't stay open. And then again, once you get to the corner, you're just going to make sure your needle is still in the fabric. You're going to get as close to the edge as you can, and then just leave the needle in the fabric, pick up the foot, and you can then rotate the fabric. Now before you continue stitching, this is when we're going to add the strap. So what I always do is I look at whichever edge has the cleaner stitching, that's the one that I leave out, and then the one that has the messier stitching is the one I attach to the mask. So you're going to tuck it about half an inch to an inch underneath the mask so that way we can stitch over top of the strap. And then just continue along the edge until you get close to the next corner. And then again, you're just going to grab your next strap, look for the cleaner end, and then the messier end is what you're going to have about half an inch to an inch attached to your mask. You're going to tuck it underneath the mask. And I always make sure that the clean edge is facing out so that the edges of my straps that we sewed before are facing towards my head when I have it on. The bottom edge, you can just sew all along that edge straight. You don't have to do any work on this side. There's not going to be anything you're going to mess up here. So just go all the way to the next corner, leave the needle in the fabric, lift the foot, turn the fabric, then we're going to add another strap right here. Again, half an inch to an inch should be underneath your piece of fabric, just like this. Put your foot down and then continue stitching along the edge until you get close to the last corner. And then make sure to push the bobby pin out of the way so that way when your foot gets down there it doesn't mess up your sewing machine. Once you're close to the end, just attach your last strap like we've done before. And then once you get to the end, make sure that you do a reverse stitch and a little bit of a front stitch so that way your stitching doesn't come undone, and then just trim your ends. And then you can take a little bit of time to trim any other pieces that might remain, like that one, and you should be able to feel that your bobby pin is in there for the nose piece. We will secure that a little bit better later in the video. Alright, we're almost done. We're just going to add the pleats to the mask so they conform to your face. So we're going to start at the bottom of the mask, so make sure that the bobby pin is at the top, and you're going to want to look at the pretty side of your mask, so whatever side you want to face out. Now fold up about an inch from the bottom, and then fold it back on itself, just like this. You're going to fold an inch up, and then, yep, about an inch and a half actually, up to you. It's usually easier to do with bigger sections, so I'm going to do about an inch and a half. Fold it up, and then fold that fold back on itself, and pin the edges. I also like to do a pin in the middle, just so that way my fold doesn't come undone while I'm sewing. Even though we won't be sewing in the middle of the mask at all, I do add pins in the middle just to help keep that fold nice and neat. Okay, now we're going to add another pleat. So you're going to leave about probably 1/2 inch, however wide your bottom pleat was, you're going to make your next one about the same size and just fold the fabric on itself and then back on itself again, and then pin the edges and the middle if you wish. And I like to make sure my edges are nice and straight as I go, because sometimes as you're working they become a little bit misaligned. And then you should have enough fabric to do one more pleat at the top, just like this. And so again, make sure your edges line up nicely, and then just pin your work on the edges and in the middle. Don't be alarmed if once you have added your pins for your pleats, if your mask looks really thin. That is normal, and it will look right when you are done sewing the pleats together. So to sew the pleats, I like to start at the bottom just because the fabric there is generally thinner, and you're going to go inside the stitch that you did before, so that way your stitch is a little bit less than 1/2 inch away from your edges. And make sure to flatten your fabric as you stitch. Don't forget to do a reverse stitch on each side. Again, I'm just starting at the bottom of the mask and going up towards the top, removing my pins as I go. And don't mind me as I fix my thread that came undone. So again, just make sure that as you stitch, your edges are lined up as much as possible and your fabric is as flat as possible. Don't forget to do the reverse stitch. And then you can take out the pins from the middle. We don't need them anymore. And then when you unfold your mask, you should be able to see that it is quite wide. And now we are just going to stitch around the nose piece so that way it doesn't move back and forth. So you want it to be fairly well in the middle, and then just use your finger to mark where you're going to add a stitch. And you'll be able to see this a little bit closer up in just a second, but you're going to add a little bit of a stitch about 1/2 inch long. Just do a front stitch for a second, reverse, and then front stitch again. Trim it, and then just push the bobby pin or whatever you are using for your nose piece over to that stitch so it is tight as possible. And then you are going to add a short stitch on the opposite side at the other end of the nose piece. You might want to go kind of slow so that way if your fabric gets caught, you can have time to push it through like I did. Trim your ends, and then when you look at it up close, you should be able to see that there are stitches on either side of your nose piece, and here it is on. So that is how you make a mask with straps. Thanks for watching. Bye.